Yeah, good, mate. Good. So, we'll talk about the UN then, yeah? Well,
Sounds good.
yeah. So, do you want to start off by talking about what you've found out from doing this book read?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book I'm reading is G. Edward Griffin's book. It's called The Fearful Master, and it was published in 1964. And I found a copy of it on eBay, and it was an unread copy. Now, most copies of this book are battered and they've been well thumbed, and this was a pristine unread copy, and it was in a plastic bag with a lot of extra material that came with it, like documentation and reports. And it's got a copy of the UN Charter. It's got a copy of a document called the 46 Angry Men, right? Which on its own is between $40 and $70 if you just want to buy that one thing. So I grabbed it, and we've started reading it on the channel now. We're about two-thirds of the way through it. And what it's revealing is that the origins of the UN, which is kind of obscured and left out of the history books and not talked about very much, has a really deep tie with communism and people who are sympathetic with the international communist movement. And so the book came along at a very good time because we'd finished reading Fabian Freeway on the channel, which is all about the British Fabian Socialist group who formed and had a part to play in the establishment of the Labour Party. And so it came along. It was published around the same time as that. And what we learn is that there's quite a checkered history of the UN. It's been involved in quite a number of controversies, which I
Mm.
think are sort of whitewashed over. And
Yeah.
the and we get a lot of programming and propaganda, which is pro UN in our schools, aimed at our young people, and we don't realize the origins of this organization, what it might actually be about. And maybe it's not just about peacekeeping and human rights and
Yeah.
looking out for the welfare of the whole of the human race, you know?
Yeah. No, certainly that's if you just ask me as a novice what the UN's about, you'd say, well, it came out of the League of Nations, which was basically trying to set up to prevent wars, and then you had World War II coming along, and then the UN really is just the rebranding, isn't it?
Yeah,
Would you
exactly.
say?
Exactly. They gave it a go
So,
with the League of Nations and that sort of collapsed and fell apart.
yeah.
America withdrew. They weren't really happy with it. Then the UN came along. And this book is written from the point of view of an American. And what the case that he's making is how the national sovereignty of of America, the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, all the things which were so unique to the establishment of the country have been kind
Yeah.
of undercut and thrown by the wayside in favor of this allegiance to this new supranational organization, the UN, which he's arguing is a more sort of socialist slash communist in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's very revealing because I think a lot of people assume, oh, they want to prevent war, that's a good thing. Then it must be a great thing to have those people out there doing what they do.
Two things, Nick. First one is, I think from our own memories, of the Iraq War, um, Tony Blair basically was talking about how they had to get UN resolutions to go to war, and then all of a sudden he didn't need those, and off they went. Um, so I think it's been obvious, hasn't it, really, for that the UN has been there's been lots of wars since World War II,
Yeah.
lots of civil wars. So it's kind of self-evident that the UN hasn't really. I suppose one thing you could say is that we don't know how history would have played. Maybe there would have been more wars. That's probably the counter argument.
Yeah, yeah. The other side of it, the argument is like, what have they prevented? But it's hard to prove a negative. Oh, well, if it wasn't there, then all this wouldn't have happened. But one interesting thing about the book that I didn't know about and is worth sort of sharing with your audience and yourself is in the Congo. Have you ever heard of Katanga, the city in the Congo?
I haven't.
So it turns out, and one of my viewers let me know this, that Lenny Henry apparently had a catchphrase which was something like "Yay Katanga" or something like that. I don't know, the comedian Lenny Henry. Does that
Yeah, I
ring a bell?
remember. Yeah, I remember that. Yep.
Yeah, so Katanga is a city and it's in the Congo. And the first part of the book is explaining what Ed Griffin, the author, calls a case study of what happened in Katanga. Now, there was some disputes going on in the Congo about who was going to, who was going to get control of the country. Basically, there was some people vying for control, and they were more sympathetic with communism and had been wined and dined by the Soviets. And there was another gentleman, and he was more interested in the American way of doing things with the sort of democracy and the checks and balances of the American system. And
Yeah,
what happened was that the UN came in fully in favor of the sort of communist leaning people there. The group of
yeah,
um, sort of the how can I explain it? I always get mixed up because there's these words thrown around like mercenaries and freedom fighters and
yeah, yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah. Hired
But
hired hands, aren't they? Guns for hire.
yeah, and he's saying in the book that at this time in the Congo, there was all sorts of terrible things going on all over the place.
Yeah,
There was cannibalism was being brought back in certain areas,
yeah,
and all these different issues that the UN could have chosen to focus on and to go in and get involved with and straighten out. They decided to go to Katanga, which at the time was peaceful, and they sent all these people over there, and they basically muscled in to prevent Katanga seceding from the Republic of the Congo and becoming its
yeah,
own sort of little state. So what you kind of see there in the microcosm is an example of how, the people who want to be left alone, we want to go over here and do our own thing. We'll govern
yeah,
ourselves. We'll rule ourselves. No, you're not being left alone. You're going to be brought in under the wing of this like larger bureaucracy and larger control system. Now, there's also an angle of that whole story, which is that Katanga had a lot of mineral wealth and
yeah,
resources. So that was another part of it.
yeah.
But it's a very fascinating case study and part of history that I'd never heard of. So I've really enjoyed learning about that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting though. I agree completely that the UN, it's basically run by the whatever you want to call them, the big club, let's say. But they've got other tools, or they don't even need the UN. Like so, if something that I didn't really know too much about was that Mau Mau thing in Kenya, which the British Empire was involved in. Well, they just like slaughtered loads of Kenyan people.
I didn't know about that either.
Uh, probably about money. Um, basically the slaughter that took place in Libya didn't really have anything to do. The boots on the ground weren't UN boots. There were again a lot of people with yeah, you'd call them mercenaries, wouldn't you? People of a particular faith, you know, bad people arming those people and then them doing whatever they. So it's what I'm trying to get at, Nick, is that yeah, I'm not a fan of the UN at all, not at all. But I think the UN is just a part of the story, really. Um,
Absolutely, yeah. It's a tool that's being used, like you said, and they have many
yeah,
tools, and it's not the spider at the center of the web, that's for sure. But I
yeah,
think one of the purposes that it serves is to indoctrinate people into a sense of global unity, a one world
yeah,
system of whether that's and they talk about it and there's a lot of quotes in the book about how what we need is to indoctrinate young people not
yeah,
to be trained into nationalism by their families. We need to come
yeah.
between the youth and their families and program them with this idea of being a global citizen, right? And
You know,
so
you know, you
it's
know what, Nick? I don't think it's working. I don't think it's working. From
no.
from my conversations with young people, it's not working at all. But sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's really good to hear. And I think you probably talk to more young people than I do because I'm kind of in a little bit of a bubble with my books here and my YouTube channel. So that's really good to hear. But it's just staggering to see how blatant it is. And they talk
Yeah,
about, right, we gotta jam a wedge really between their parents and pry them away from their parents and indoctrinate them with a
yeah.
worldview that sets them at odds with their family, their community, and their culture. So it's great to hear that it's backfiring and the pendulum swinging the other
Just
way.
going back to the UN, what I like, I did a tiny bit of reading on it about it. One thing that you can maybe correct me on is that my reading of the situation is the UN. It just seems like a talking shop because to do anything, the host country has to agree to it. They have to agree to UN involvement.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it just
it
seems
is.
to me like another one of these globalist talking shops.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument for that, and I've talked to other people as well who've described it as kind of a paper tiger because none of the
Yeah,
agreements are binding. But
yeah,
the interesting thing is the amount of countries that have signed up to it, which is almost every
yeah,
single country in the world at this point. So
yeah.
it's nearly all of them. And at what point do they go, okay, now we need to switch it. Now we need to actually make agreements that are
Interesting.
binding agreements. Yeah. And they've done this with the WHO pandemic treaty, right? For example.
Yeah,
They're trying to do this at least.
exactly. But in a way, you we now know that in basically all countries, the people who get to the top in politics, they don't get to the top because we vote them in. They get to the top because they're high up in the big club. And then the kind of the UN is just, a bit, maybe a bit like Davos in the sense. It's just it's something that they go to. It's an institution that they go to and they interact with each other, and it's a good cover story for their interactions. I don't know.
Yeah, they're
I
just
just
getting
have that.
together because they care about us and they're worried about our future and they want the best for us.
Yeah,
That's why they're getting together, isn't it?
of course, Nick. Of course, but I don't know I've got one other thing to sort of to come back on as well is because I heard part four this morning. I was, how YouTube is, it'll throw things up at random.
Yeah.
So your video, it throwed up part four for some reason. That's so I watched that, and the guy, the author of the book. So it was published in what, 58? You say
64.
64, right? So that's not quite at the height of the Red Terror, but I just noticed this. It was almost like a writing, like a nervous tick from the writer, because he kept whenever he talked about China, it wasn't just China, it was Red China. And what I think is that this whole thing about communism, oh, the World Economic Forum is communist, and Sir Keir Starlin, he's communist. Um, there's certainly there's certainly sort of strong elements of it, but I think we've got to be quite careful about the words we use to describe this thing. And for me, what I would much prefer is technocracy as a word.
Absolutely.
I think the UN is pushing a technocratic world. That's what they want, where the government decides what, how, and for whom to produce, and every aspect of life is regulated by these central planners.
You hit the nail on the head there as well. And I think it's important to remember that when he wrote this in the 64, he was very earnest and genuine in his belief that the threat to freedom, let's say, was coming
Yeah,
from Red China, was coming from the Soviets and the USSR.
yeah,
The author's still alive. He's still speaking, doing podcasts and interviews, and putting together conferences and these kind of things. And he has since admitted that since he wrote the book, more research and authors have come forward and done more digging to
yeah,
show that actually the communists, they were funded from the same sort of oligarch capitalist Western money, such as like the Rockefeller families.
yeah.
And so it is a dialectic, it's a dialectic that's been given to us and has been managed from the start. So it's a very good point to put on there. I actually prefaced either the part five, I think the last part, with that very point because somebody in my group mentioned it and said, "Oh, since he's always harping on about the communists, but a better
Yeah.
word to bear in mind would be something like globalists."
Yeah,
So that's a
or
really
I
good
would
point.
say technocratic, because that's fundamentally what they want, which is government sovereignty rather than consumer sovereignty. You know
Yeah.
how they like to create these two-way splits, these dichotomies and then we're expected to choose one thing or another. That what they present is communism or fascism as two kind of extreme positions, and then you have, like, I don't know, left and right and then centrist and stuff. For me, it's quite an easy trap to fall into, to just label, like, Klaus Schwab's and all the Great Reset communist.
Mhm.
Or then some people say it's fascist. That, like my, I don't know what you think, but because fascism, I don't know if you would agree with this. Would you, I believe that fascism is also a form of technocracy.
Mhm.
Would you agree
Yeah,
with
I'm not
that?
sure. I'm kind of hazy on the definitions of fascism, and I'm not sure what is again. And it's a great point. You got to define your terms. A lot of people throw
Yeah.
these isms around without really knowing whether they're referring to the same thing.
Well,
And I do
I would
view
say,
like,
I would say that fascism basically is a technocratic approach that also combines private ownership. So basically, the government still decides what's going to be produced. The state still decides production methods. The state still decides which people in society are going to consume varying amounts. But the products are produced in the private sector, and the state gets its will by highly regulating the private sector. And I think that that's what's happening now is that I don't think you could call what's going on in the UK or America, you couldn't really call it communism because this private ownership. Have you heard of this one? Mussolini defined fascism as the union of state with corporate power.
that's the one that I've heard. Yeah, that's the one that I
Yeah,
usually default to.
but that's what it exactly means is that this in Nazi Germany the state decided whether they were going to produce Messerschmitt fighters or Heinkel bombers or whatever. It was the state that decided what types of music even were going to be played in Nazi Germany. The state obviously decided production methods. So the
Hmm.
state was
So
issuing edicts to companies that were theoretically privately owned, but there wasn't really genuine private ownership because there was no real private property rights. The state could take away from you at a whim.
So I think that's a really good point. And what one of the, I think communism, the label communism and socialism, from what I've been learning in the last two books, and granted they were written in the 60s, so they're dated now, but it's a kind of way to get good people on board. Don't you want to see more fairness? Don't you want to see more
Yeah.
equal distribution of goods and wealth? Don't you want things to be better for the average working Joe and Jane? Of course you do, because you're a good person. Well, join the Socialist Party and we'll lobby to help make that happen, you know?
Or Nick in 1930s Germany, it would be join the National Socialist Party because
There you
Hitler
are.
was saying the same thing. He was saying
Yeah.
exactly the same thing that the Jews, they have too much, the white Aryans are being oppressed. It was not really any different from what Jeremy Corbyn or what Starmer, they preach their own version of social justice. It's all the only thing that's different is the ethnic groups that they favor and the ethnic
Yeah.
groups that they persecute.
And that's the thing about the UN is that the UN has codified it all into these SDGs, you know, the goals, the however many there are, and making the governments and the corporations all sign on to that. It's kind of like the golden thread that goes through, you see.
Can you see now why I think it's more like fascism?
Right.
Because you've not got state ownership, have you? And like in communism, you would have state ownership with the SDGs and all the diversity, equity, inclusion regulation. It's all about the state achieving what it wants to achieve through private ownership.
Right. And centralizing that as well, I think is this is another
Yeah, well,
aspect is that
of course. Well, that's what technocracy by definition is centralized because you have a handful. One thing that communism and fascism have in common is central planners at the very top, technocrats.
mhm.
It's just how they achieve, what to produce, how to produce, for whom is slightly different in terms of ownership.
Yeah. Yeah, I see
But
what
I
you're saying.
think, and I think one thing that gets me, like in the more less enlightened people than you, Nick, is that truthers they argue between, oh, is it communism, is it fascism? You know, really the term we should be using is technocracy. It's
Yeah, you're absolutely
technocratic.
right. Yeah, because they've now got, they didn't have previously, you know, the internet. They didn't have the digital access to all this data and information and algorithmic, powerful crunching software that can crunch numbers. Now they've got that. They've got this system, and you know, they're getting everybody plugged into it. They're getting young people hopelessly addicted to and hooked onto this technology and being online all the time and gathering all this data. So you can see how rolling, how the UN getting all these countries to sign up to it, just as the internet is also linking everybody together, sets the stage for a kind of one world system, eventually. How it could go that way. I'm not saying it will. I don't think anything's set in stone, but you can kind of, that's what I'm sort of seeing at the UN is they got it, they set it up, they sold it to people, they brainwashed and used their propaganda. I've got here, this is 1947, You and the United Nations, children's
Yeah.
book. Just picture book, basically explaining how your country is a lot of nonsense, and really you owe your allegiance to the world and the globe and the different people in the world. So you can kind of see how like the stage is now set through through the selling of communist and socialist ideas to break down certain aspects of free market capitalism, of Christianity. Communism is
Yeah.
is overtly subversive when it comes to Christianity. They want the state to
Yeah.
be God. So it's
Yeah. That's
atheistic
it.
by nature,
That's it.
and that has fed into the United Nations, which has fed into SDGs and the sort of World Economic Forum technocracy, as you're saying. And now you've got almost every country in the world signed up for it. So it's a very interesting time to be
But
alive, to
but
say
yeah,
the least.
but then then again, they can have these agreements, they can have these plans, but ultimately, what does it depend on?
People's actions and going along with it
Yeah.
and behavior. Yeah, because it's an
Yeah.
offer and you can refuse it. Absolutely.
Exactly. And if you combine it with their sort of environmental goals, which really are just you will consume less and you will accept it. Well, I don't think people will accept it.
Good.
I
I'm
don't,
glad you're
I don't,
feeling that way.
because people, yeah, even the wokesters. I remember on the internet the other day, there was somebody who took a photograph of somebody on a civil airliner with a Just Stop Oil t-shirt on. So they like going on holiday as
Oh
well.
yeah.
That what they want is for other people to not consume, but when the rubber hits the road, people will object to it, or they're already starting to object to it. But just one
So I'd
thing
like
was,
to hear.
yeah,
I
just
was going to
one
ask
one
about
last.
your interactions with younger people. You said you feel like
I've
you've
got
talked
to
to some
be, I've
people who
got
are
to be,
not.
I've got to be careful
Oh,
about
fair
what
enough.
who are. I'm not, but yeah, um, the person that I spoke to has got quite strong opinions, and from the people that he knows, um, knows a lots of people, but they're just not buying it. What they're doing is just living their lives,
Fantastic.
ignoring it. Um, but one thing that I was going to come back to, because I know there'll be some people that will say, "Oh, well, the Great Reset, it is more like communism, blah 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 blah," because they're pushing an internationalism, and I do have sympathy with that, because most the fascism, well, certainly National Socialism, fascism was very nationalistic, and certainly that's not the current thrust of the UN, but certainly in terms of ownership, it the UN, World Economic Forum, it's they're not talking about mass nationalization.
Hmm.
What they're
Yeah.
talking about is mass regulation of private enterprise, which is exactly what Hitler did to achieve his technocracy. But so that was the thing that I wanted to sort of run past you, after listening to you go through that part four. But what other things have you learned, Nick, from that book?
Okay. So yeah, the main thing is this incredible sort of left-leaning communist socialist sort of origins of the UN, let's say, because that is very much occulted and hidden from us. Um, I was surprised to also read about the strategies and the tactics used to get people on board, to believe in it as a good thing. Like there was an interesting anecdote that came out. It might have been the part that you listened to about American soldiers in the Korean War, and the ones who were taken captive and by the other side, there was a report written about how they had no allegiance to their home country. They weren't loyal to any religion. They weren't loyal to their families. They were easy to change to the other side. Some of them ended up staying, on the communist side. And so the Korean War is kind of marks a turning point in that attitude of the soldier to the country that he's supposed to be fighting for, and sort of suggests that around that time is when the propaganda had taken hold. And so there's quotes in the book as well of military, maybe generals, sort of saying the people who are coming in now, they have no idea what they're fighting for. They have no idea what went into America to get it to where it is today. They don't have a sense of patriotic duty and loyalty. They don't have a sense of, for I was going to say for king and country, but for God and for their Christian roots and background. That
Yeah,
had all been sort of bred out of people, and I think that that has continued to the present day, because it's been, what, 60 years since the book was written, and
yeah,
mostly people get a sort of scientific materialist atheism in schooling and in television, and a lot of the comedy that you get on the television, I think, comes from this sort of angle, and that lays the ground. That is the sort of foundation on which you build this idea of an international or supranational organization controlling things being good, because it'll prevent war. You don't want any war, do you? War is terrible. We want peace. How do we keep peace globally? Well, we need one organization to run everything,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then nobody will fight
yeah,
each other. So just the roots, the turning points of where the ideology took hold in people's minds
yeah,
has been very interesting to read, because I certainly grew up with a sense of, if you were proud of your country, it was kind of a right-leaning, far-right, thuggish type of thing.
mm,
The BMP would be going around with their
mm,
St. George's Cross or their
mm,
Union Jacks, versus, for example, when I went over and spent time living in Vietnam, people over there would wear the t-shirts with the Vietnamese flag, and it
yeah,
would be a source of pride, and
yeah,
it would be very a good thing, and nobody would think twice about it. And I reflected on my own conditioning, because when I'm here in England and I see people, when I was growing up, seeing people wielding those flags around, I'd be like, oh, that
yeah,
guy's probably a racist idiot. So I've been
yeah.
conditioned to associate my own flag, the country of the country of my birth, with racism, with bigotry, and with these negative kind of qualities. And that's direct from sort of UN programming and propaganda techniques.
You know what, Nick? If you talked to me maybe 20 years ago, I think I was probably quite like you 20 years ago or 10 years ago, whenever it was.
Right.
Um, but I don't know about you, but like, well, I'll ask you, like, you've revisited that though, haven't you? You don't hold those opinions anymore.
No, not at all. No, not at all. Now that I'm a lot more aware of internationalism, of technocracy, of these kind of agendas which seek to homogenize cultures and societies everywhere, I
Yeah,
recognize, and having traveled, especially having traveled and lived in different countries and benefited from their rich culture and their differences in the way they do things, and the food and the clothes and the even the religions, visiting temples, seeing architecture, seeing the way they run their infrastructure in the countries, you go, oh, actually, it's good that we have different nations with different personalities and
yeah.
characteristics,
But
and
but
we
but
we can
talking
enjoy that.
about your own country, Britain, though, it's I don't have a problem with being proud of British history.
No,
What I'm trying to get at, Nick, is that I think the big club has got a problem because I suspect that Nick Hayes and Nigel Watson are not particularly unusual in that over the last 4 or 5 years. I think many people have come to that. They've had it. They've almost like over egged it. They've gone so hard that eventually people have just they've repelled against it. So they don't. I don't see the Union flag as being racist or far right. Quite the opposite. I don't think there's anything wrong in well, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your own country. In fact, there's plenty of things that are extremely good about being proud of your own country and your own history and um, your own kind of genetic background too, your own like genealogy, family history going back. It's who we are, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. But I think, and I agree with you. I think there's been such a forceful like amplification of a certain narrative that it's okay for this group of people to celebrate their cultural roots and their history, but
Yeah,
this group of people over here have a very shameful and terrible past of atrocities, and they've been
yeah.
very bad, and you've been a very naughty boy, and you cannot be proud of who you are and where you come from because your history is just one that needs to be erased. That's kind of where people are seeing
But
this statues being pulled down and whatnot.
yeah, and also that this sort of programming that they've been, you're all far right. You're all far right. You're all far. This is what the I don't know that Ed Bull's wife. What's she? She's particularly odious. She's the home. I think she's Home Secretary now. Um, Yvette Cooper. That's it. Um,
Right.
well, if you keep on telling people everyone's far right, well, then people realize, well, like none of us can be far right then.
Yeah.
You're telling
Yeah,
us
that's a
we're
good
all
point.
far right. Well, none of us are far right. You've
It's the
kind
boy
of,
who cried wolf, isn't it?
yeah,
Look at all
exactly,
these far right people
exactly,
everywhere, and
exactly.
they're just standing there with their families and their garden, and they're working hard. Maybe they've got a small business and they're going to church, and they're like, "We're not far right. Why are we being labeled
Uh, and
like this?"
and I think maybe I don't know because I'm not there, but I hope that there's a resurgence in being proud of Britain and Britain's history.
That very much depends, doesn't it, on I think the youth and young people. And I was thinking just today about how could I reach more young people with the kind of messages and the views that we talk about and share on
Yeah,
our channels. And because if they've been so thoroughly indoctrinated into this UN SDG global citizen type of mentality from a very
yeah.
young age, it's going to be hard to unpick that and reverse it
I
because
think,
many of them will
yeah,
grow up just seeing, oh, I'm surrounded by all these different nationalities and different people, and I don't really have an identity that I'm connected to apart from, what I have in common with everyone else around the world,
yeah.
which is bringing it down to that.
You've got there is a subset of the population that do buy into all of that. They will have held on to those messages from school. They'll believe in them. They'll rebroadcast them. This is the kind of virtue signaler, like socialist type. Who's often I know plenty of them. Who
Right.
well, not plenty of them. I know again, I'm not going to talk about who this person is, but it's like they'll bore you to death about their veganism, apart from when they, have a bacon sandwich or something, or they'll go on about how important it is to save the planet whilst going on about 4 or 5 foreign holidays a year. That type of. But I think that there's many people who are not like that, and I think they are struggling to like that was one of the reasons why I think they went for the Divok thing in that
Mm.
the global climate boiling wasn't appealing to enough people to get them to go along with a technocracy. And I think they're becoming more as they become more and more desperate and more extreme, all they do is that they get more people to question what's going on. And that's like, a thin end of a long wedge that ends up where me and you are fully
Yeah,
awake.
that's great. Yeah, I really hope so. I'm glad to hear you've got a more of an optimistic take on it. Sometimes I do despair about the number of people with their necks bent at 90 degrees staring down at their phones while the day is beautiful and the weather's good and they're walking, around just glued to these little devices that are doing, and it depends. Maybe they're watching your videos, in which case that's all good. But
Well, no, I don't think, of course they're not. They're not watching my videos, but they're pursuing their own self-interest. Yeah. And when Klaus comes around along and says you won't go on a foreign holiday or you're not going to be able to eat like proper burgers at McDonald's, you've got to have like plant-based rubbish. Well, they are for this is the other thing about woke is it's created a lot of selfish people who don't think about anybody else but themselves. They have no,
Mhm.
the globalist thing of internationalism. You, in a way that tethers, it encourages more selfish thinking, doesn't it? You haven't got a community, you haven't got a country, you've just got yourself.
Well, you'll end up with that situation where you've got like a very idealistic, let's say, young teenage. I'm just going to say girl because it tends to be more
Yeah,
girls who fall into this
yeah,
category, but they might be like, all right, I'm going to be vegan because I'm going to save the planet.
yeah,
Meanwhile, they never, visit their grandmother and
yeah,
spend time with her, for example, because maybe she smells funny and she says weird stuff like, that's
yeah.
racist now. But
Or they'll never go on holiday to Morecambe or whatever. They'll go a holiday, do long haul in wherever, Dubai or whatever in the February or something. Um, but I think that there's only about, even amongst young girls, not all of them have bought into that. Honestly, I'd say it's a minority, somewhere between a quarter and a third.
nice.
Are kind of
That's great.
raging authoritarians, and they want to kind of they want somebody to run their own life, some technocrat to run their life and run everyone else's life. But then once they get on the sharp end, even that 25-30%, once they feel the sharp end of technocracy themselves, and this is again where you have to couple with the environment, what they're trying to achieve is a reduction in their quality of life. And
Yes.
the woke people, they're not just gonna happily go with that.
Yeah, that's true. They'll flip very quickly once the announcement is made that, oh, you're only allowed to buy one new piece of clothing every 6 months.
Yeah, yeah. If you think about Hitler, why was he so popular? Well, basically, what he was doing was just looting other people's stuff. Like he was just seizing the assets of the Jewish population and then uh, redistributing the loot that the Nazi state stole, and then redistributed it
Mm.
to his client group who voted for him. And I think like was it 1933 when he kind of his electoral power, he never got more than 34-35% of the vote.
That's kind
But
of
then
like the
he
current government in the UK, then,
Yeah,
isn't it?
but he did false flag attacks, burning down the Reichstag, blaming it on communists, the other side. That would be the equivalent of many of these events. I don't know about you. I won't even talk about these events anymore because they want us to talk about them, and I'd much rather talk about their authoritarianism.
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, your video I think you put up today talking about how it gets tiring analyzing it and trying to keep up with things and understanding clown world when actually it'd be much better for us to pivot onto solutions and actions that people can take and spreading more of a message of optimism and hope and joy and explaining to people what can be done rather than just staring and going
Yeah,
and
or
panicking.
the tougher message is that we've got into this situation because there were too many morally compromised people in our society who went along with things that they should never have gone along with.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge for all of us is rather than asking other people to change, we've got to look within and try to be better people. We can only control what we do, and that's where I think we win this actually is by obviously through non-compliance, but then we become exemplars ourselves
Yeah.
of how to behave, good people.
Yeah, well said. And it always reminds me of, I think Michael Jackson nailed it in that song, Man in the Mirror, That was
Yeah,
when he really just got that message. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change. And he just
yeah,
nailed it in that one song. And when you
brilliant.
do that over a long enough amount of time, don't tell people you're doing it, just do it. And then after a
Yeah,
few weeks, a few months, they'll look at you and they'll go, what are you doing? Something's changed. They can see it. And then
yeah,
you'll be way more likely to get other people to also make a change. But if you're just telling them and lecturing them and you're a bad person
yeah,
and you need to stop
yeah.
eating meat and you need to eat the bugs, they're just going to tell you to,
Yeah, yeah,
stay where the sun don't shine.
especially when they see you having a sneaky burger, or your veganism and vegetarianism is a little bit inconsistent. But it's gonna cut off in a minute. But that Wacko Jacko, that was a late stage Wacko Jacko, wasn't it? Before he got whacked.
Was it? I'm not sure when
Yeah, I
that
think
song came
so.
out, in fact.
Wasn't it Man in the Met? But him and Bob Marley, I suppose. I'm not listening to what Bob Marley had to say. He was preaching the same sort of message, wasn't he?
Yeah, and
And
and the
yeah,
story about how he died is incredibly suspicious. Oh, he got cancer because he
exactly.
was playing football.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. But I think that's the way we go, Nick. I think. But Really great to chat. We'll have another chat if you're up for it soon about like maybe diet, fitness. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I got loads to say on that, so that would be an absolute
Brilliant.
pleasure. Looking forward
Brilliant.
to it.
Okay, we'll do it in a couple of weeks then, Nick.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks a lot.
All right, it's going to cut off in a sec. All the best.